Are you enjoying these untold Sherlock Holmes stories? If so, you can listen to even more exclusive Untold Sherlock Holmes adventures on my Patreon. Do check it out. The link is in the description below. The Trepoff Murder. In glancing over my journals of the early years of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I find many cases which have tested the remarkable analytical faculties of my friend. There are some which baffled him entirely, and others which yielded their secrets only after the most exhaustive expenditure of his singular energies. Yet, among all the records that fill my battered dispatch boxes, there is perhaps none which so perfectly illustrates the triumph of cold, precise deduction over seemingly insurmountable physical impossibility as the bizarre affair which we came to know as the Trepoff murder. It was a case that took us far from the familiar fogs of Baker Street, plunging us into the volatile political machinations of the Russian Empire, and ultimately securing for Holmes the gratitude of the Romanov dynasty. It was in the early days of August. London was baking under a relentless, suffocating summer sun. The heat radiated from the pavement in shimmering waves, and the air within our sitting room was heavy and stagnant, despite the windows being thrown wide open to the sluggish Thames breeze. For 3 days, Holmes had scarcely spoken a word. The criminal classes of the metropolis had seemingly taken a holiday to the seaside, leaving my friend to languish in a state of profound and dangerous ennui. He spent his hours pacing the floor with the restless energy of a caged beast, occasionally pausing to scratch out a discordant chord upon his violin, or to reach for the 7% solution of cocaine, which I so fervently despised. "My mind rebels at stagnation, Watson," he murmured that morning, tossing aside the daily papers with a gesture of supreme disgust. "Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis, and I am in my own proper atmosphere. I can dispense then with artificial stimulants. I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave mental exaltation." I was about to offer some soothing, commonplace reply when the heavy tread of ascending footsteps upon our stairs arrested my attention. It lacked the familiar, sprightly step of our landlady, Mrs. Hudson. Instead, it bore the measured, authoritative stride of a man accustomed to command. Holmes paused in his pacing, his sharp eyes darting toward the door. A heavy tread, Watson, and yet a hesitant one. A man of military background, unused to seeking help from civilians, driven by a desperation that overrides his pride. Let us hope he brings us salvation from this unbearable lethargy. The door opened to reveal a tall, powerfully built man with a thick, bristling moustache, and eyes as hard as polished flint. He was dressed in a suit of immaculate cut, though the heavy wool seemed entirely unsuited for the London summer. In his hand he clutched a silver-headed walking stick with a grip that turned his knuckles white. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his English heavily accented with the rolling cadences of Eastern Europe. "I am he," Holmes replied, waving a languid hand toward an armchair. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak as freely as before myself. Pray, take a seat, Count." Our visitor started, his eyes widening in alarm. "Count? How do you know my title, sir? I have not presented my card." Holmes smiled, a fleeting expression of satisfaction crossing his ascetic features. "It is my business to know things. The crest upon your signet ring is that of the House of Rostova, a family long associated with the imperial court of St. Petersburg. Your bearing is military, your attire is diplomatic. You have travelled in great haste, as evidenced by the unbrushed dust upon your left shoulder, a consequence of resting against the upholstery of a hastily chartered carriage. You are a man of high rank, accustomed to instant obedience, yet you come to my humble rooms. Therefore, you represent a client of even higher station, and the matter is one of desperate urgency." The Count sank into the offered armchair, staring at Holmes as though he were a worker of miracles. "You are everything they said you were, Mr. Holmes. I am indeed Count Vladimir Rostov, emissary of His Imperial Majesty the Tsar. I have been sent to you because the greatest minds of our Okhrana, our secret police, have been utterly defeated by a mystery so profound, so diabolical, that it threatens to destabilize the very government." Holmes rubbed his long, thin hands together, his eyes gleaming with a sudden fierce light. His lethargy vanished in an instant. "Pray, Count, lay before us the facts. The more incomprehensible the matter appears, the more likely it is to contain the key to its own solution." The locked room. The Count leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "You are acquainted, perhaps, with the name of General Pyotr Trepoff?" "Ah," Holmes murmured, reaching for his pipe. General Trepoff, formerly of the secret police himself, a man known for his iron fist and his unyielding suppression of the nihilist factions, a man with 1,000 enemies, each more desperate than the last. "Exactly," the Count agreed, his face grim. "Trepoff was a necessary instrument of the state. Consequently, his methods made him a prime target for assassination. For years he has lived under the heaviest guard. Last week he travelled to Odessa, on the coast of the Black Sea, to oversee the dismantling of a newly discovered anarchist printing press. He was residing in his private estate, a veritable fortress." Count Rostov paused, wiping a bead of perspiration from his brow before continuing. "On the evening of the 2nd of August, Trepoff retreated to his study on the 2nd floor of the manor. The study has only one door, which opens into a long, narrow corridor. There are no secret passages, no adjoining chambers. The walls are solid stone. The windows are heavily barred with iron gratings that have not been disturbed in a century, and they overlook a sheer drop of 40 feet to the courtyard below." "And the door?" Holmes asked, his eyes closed, his fingertips pressed together in his characteristic attitude of intense concentration. "Guarded," the Count replied, his voice trembling slightly. "Guarded by 20 men of the Preobrazhensky Regiment, the most elite soldiers in the Russian Empire. They were stationed elbow to elbow in the corridor. No one could have passed them. The door was locked from the inside by Trepoff himself, as was his custom. The soldiers stood at absolute attention. At precisely midnight, they heard a muffled thud from within the study, followed by a sharp cry, and then a heavy fall. And then I leaned forward, utterly engrossed in the narrative. The captain of the guard immediately demanded entry, the Count continued. Receiving no answer, he ordered his men to break down the door. It was a massive thing of solid oak, and it took them several minutes with axes to splinter the lock and force their way in. When they burst into the room, they found General Trepoff lying upon the great Persian rug, a stiletto driven precisely into his heart. "Dead?" I asked. "Instantly," the Count replied. "The horror of the situation, Dr. Watson, is that the room was entirely empty. The windows were still locked and barred from the inside. The chimney is entirely bricked up, leaving only a narrow flue for a stove. The floorboards are undisturbed. There was no one beneath the furniture. 20 men watched the only exit, and none saw a soul enter or leave. The assassin had struck down one of the most powerful men in Russia and vanished like smoke into the air. Silence descended upon our Baker Street sitting-room, broken only by the ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. The situation, as the Count described it, seemed to defy all laws of nature. It was the absolute perfection of a locked-room mystery. Holmes opened his eyes, shining with a brilliant, almost predatory intensity. "A stiletto, you say, rather than a firearm?" "A stiletto, Mr. Holmes, wielded with immense force." "And the state of the room? Was there a struggle?" "None. The General's papers were undisturbed. A half-finished cup of tea sat upon his desk." "The desk," Holmes murmured. "Describe it to me." "It is a massive piece of furniture," the Count replied, looking somewhat puzzled by the specific inquiry. "Commissioned by Catherine the Great, I believe. Solid Russian oak, heavily carved, dominating the centre of the room. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, it was thoroughly searched. There was no one beneath it." Holmes sprang to his feet with the agility of a panther. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to look up the train schedules for the continent. We must make for Vienna, and from there catch the express to the Black Sea coast." "You will take the case?" Count Rostov gasped, rising hastily. "Take it? My dear Count, I would not miss it for the world. A man murdered in a sealed box surrounded by the Tsar's finest is a problem of the most exquisite proportions. We leave for Odessa tonight." The journey to Odessa. The journey across the continent was a long and arduous one, made bearable only by Holmes's unceasing stream of deductions and hypotheses. As we rattled across the endless plains of Eastern Europe in our first-class carriage, Holmes spent hours poring over a large-scale map of the Odessa estate, smoking pipe after pipe of the strongest black shag tobacco until the compartment was thick with the acrid fumes. "You see, Watson," he explained one evening as we approached the Russian border, tracing a long, stained finger over the map, "when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The assassin could not have entered or exited through the windows. The bars were untouched." "Agreed," I said. "He could not have escaped up the chimney." "Impossible, given the flue. And he could not have walked past 20 elite guards in a brightly lit corridor." "Certainly not." "Then we are left with only two possible conclusions," Holmes stated, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "Either the assassin was entirely supernatural, a theory which I categorically reject as an insult to the rational mind, or the assassin never left the room at all." "The room was searched," I protested. "The Count was most explicit. There was nowhere to hide." Holmes smiled, a thin, enigmatic stretching of the lips. "People see, Watson. However, they rarely observe. The eye glosses over what the brain expects to be there. We shall see what the Okhrana has missed." We arrived in Odessa in the suffocating heat of early August. The city, perched upon the edge of the Black Sea, was a bustling port, yet beneath the vibrant commerce lay an undercurrent of palpable tension. Uniformed soldiers were visible on every street corner, their bayonets gleaming in the sun. The assassination of General Trepoff had thrown the city into a state of martial law. We were whisked away to the Trepoff estate, a sprawling fortress-like manor house situated on a bluff overlooking the sea. Upon our arrival, we were introduced to Inspector Grigorovich, the local head of the Okhrana. He was a burly, red-faced man who looked upon Holmes with a mixture of suspicion and thinly veiled contempt. "I am told you are a genius, Mr. Holmes," Grigorovich sneered, his thick accent making the word sound like a challenge. "I fear your English parlour tricks will be of little use here. This is the work of a phantom. The Nihilists have conjured a demon to strike at the heart of the state." "I have always found, Inspector," Holmes replied coldly, "that demons are remarkably reliant upon the laws of physics. If I may be permitted to examine the scene of the crime." Grigorovich grunted and led us up the grand sweeping staircase to the second floor. We walked down a long corridor, its floor covered by a thick red runner. At the far end stood the door to the study. Its thick oak panels were violently splintered around the lock, a testament to the desperate entry of the guards. "The 20 men were stationed exactly here," Grigorovich said, gesturing to the expanse of the corridor. "They stood shoulder to shoulder. A fly could not have passed them unobserved." "And the door was locked?" Holmes asked, examining the splintered wood with his pocket magnifying glass. "Bolted from the inside. We had to smash it." Holmes nodded, his eyes darting hungrily over the woodwork. He pushed open the ruined door and stepped into the study. I followed close behind, bracing myself for the oppressive atmosphere of a murder scene. It was a vast room, panelled in dark, brooding mahogany. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall windows, which were indeed obstructed by thick iron bars set deeply into the masonry. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes bound in leather and gold. In the centre of the room, dominating the space, sat the desk Count Rostov had described. It was a monstrous piece of furniture, easily 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, covered in intricate swirling carvings. A dark, rust-coloured stain upon the magnificent Persian rug marked the spot where General Trepoff had fallen, scarcely 3 feet from the desk. Holmes said nothing. He began to move around the room like a bloodhound on the scent. He examined the barred windows, tapping the iron with his walking stick. He inspected the fireplace, thrusting his head up into the narrow flue to the detriment of his collar. He knelt upon the floor, a tape measure appearing as if by magic in his hand, and began measuring the distance from the bloodstain to the walls, to the door, to the desk. Grigorovich watched with folded arms, a smirk playing upon his lips. "As I said, Mr. Holmes, a phantom." Holmes ignored him. He approached the massive oak desk. He walked around it slowly, his eyes mere slits, his face devoid of all expression. He pulled open the heavy centre drawer, then the side drawers, examining their depths. He tapped the wood, listening intently to the reverberation. "Inspector," Holmes said suddenly, his voice ringing sharp and clear in the quiet room. "What time did the General retire to his study?" "At 8 o'clock in the evening," Grigorovich replied. "And he permitted no one to enter?" "No one. His meals were left outside the door." "I see." Holmes dropped to his hands and knees, pressing his face close to the floorboards beneath the desk. He produced his magnifying glass and crawled slowly along the perimeter of the great wooden structure. Suddenly he paused, a low exclamation of triumph escaping his lips. With a pair of tweezers, he extracted something microscopic from the gap between the floorboards and the base of the desk, dropping it into a small paper envelope. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping forward. "A trifle, Watson. A mere trifle," he replied, though his eyes blazed with the thrill of the chase. "Tell me, Inspector, when the guards broke down the door, was the room filled with smoke? The splintering of heavy oak with axes, the shattering of the iron lock, it must have created quite a cloud of dust and debris." "Yes, it was very dusty," Grigorovich admitted, frowning. "The lamps flickered violently. There was shouting, confusion. What of it?" "Only that confusion is the mother of deception," Holmes murmured. He stood up, dusting off the knees of his trousers. "Inspector, I require the immediate presence of the 20 guards who were stationed in this corridor on the night of the murder." Grigorovich bristled. "They are elite soldiers, far above the station of common suspects. I will not have them insulted." "You will summon them," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a register of icy command that brooked no argument. "Or I shall telegraph His Imperial Majesty the Tsar and inform him that the head of the Odessa Okhrana is obstructing the solution of General Trepoff's murder." The inspector turned a mottled shade of crimson, yet he spun on his heel and barked an order to an aide in the corridor. While we waited, Holmes turned his attention back to the massive desk. He produced his tape measure once more and measured the exterior depth of the desk, 48 inches. He then pulled out the central drawer and measured its interior length. 20 inches, Holmes muttered, holding up the tape for me to see. "A magnificent piece of furniture, Watson, albeit remarkably inefficient in its storage capacity. What do you suppose occupies the remaining 28 inches of depth?" I stared at the desk, the truth dawning upon me with the force of a physical blow. "Good heavens, Holmes, a hidden compartment?" "It is far more than a compartment, Watson. It is a hollow core, designed perhaps a century ago for the concealment of state secrets or imperial treasures, utilized just days ago for a far darker purpose." The phantom revealed. Before I could reply, the heavy tramp of boots announced the arrival of the guards. 20 men, clad in the magnificent gold-braided uniforms of the Preobrazhensky regiment, filed into the room, forming 2 precise ranks. They were men of imposing stature, their faces impassive, their discipline absolute. Holmes walked slowly down the line of men, his keen eyes scrutinizing every detail of their appearance. He looked at their hands, their boots, the fit of their uniforms. When he reached the end of the line, he turned back and addressed Inspector Grigorovich. "Inspector, the mystery of the locked room is a mystery no longer. It is merely an illusion born of audacity and a thorough understanding of human psychology." Grigorovich scoffed. "You have solved it? By measuring a desk and looking at my soldiers?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, stepping to the centre of the room. The impossibility of this crime rested upon the assumption that the assassin entered the room, killed the general and left the room, all while the door was guarded. The premise is entirely flawed. The assassin did not enter the room while it was guarded. He was already here. Holmes laid a hand upon the carved surface of the great oak desk. "This desk, Inspector, is hollow. Behind these shallow drawers lies a cavity roughly 4 feet wide, nearly 2.5 feet deep and 2 feet high. A space cramped, agonizing and suffocating, capable of concealing a small, determined man. A murmur rippled through the ranks of the soldiers, instantly suppressed by a glare from the inspector. "My investigation of the floorboards beneath the desk," Holmes continued, "revealed several small flakes of dried wax, of a type commonly used in the waterproofing of peasant boots rather than the polished leather of a gentleman. Furthermore, I found a single hardened crumb of black rye bread. The assassin concealed himself within this desk long before General Trepoff entered the room. Given the stifling nature of the concealment, the dust undisturbed around the base, and the singular lack of opportunity to enter the heavily guarded estate, I deduce he was smuggled into the room disguised as a workman during the recent renovations. He has been residing within this wooden tomb for no less than 2 entire days." "2 days!" I ejaculated. "The lack of air, the immobility." "A testament to the fanatical devotion of the nihilist," Holmes said grimly. He waited in darkness, subsisting on scraps of bread, breathing through the microscopic gaps in the wood carvings. He waited for the perfect moment. When the general retired for the night and locked the door, sealing his own fate, the assassin pushed open the hidden panel at the rear of the desk. He crept out, struck his lethal blow with a stiletto, and then— Holmes paused for dramatic effect. "And then what?" Grigorovich demanded, his scepticism wavering. "If he was here, where did he go? He is not in the desk now." "Indeed, he is not," Holmes agreed. "He used your own guards as his avenue of escape." "Preposterous." "Elementary," Holmes countered. When the assassin struck, the general let out a cry and fell heavily. The assassin knew the guards outside would respond instantly. He did not attempt to hide back inside the desk, a fatal error if the room was thoroughly searched. Instead, he relied on the chaos of the breach. When your men swung their axes, splintering the oak door, the room was plunged into violent confusion. Wood flew. Dust billowed in thick clouds, lamps flickered, and 19 highly adrenalized men poured into a confined space. 19! Grigorovich interrupted, his face purple. There were 20. There were 20 when the roll was called afterward, Holmes corrected sharply. The assassin neutralized a guard in the barracks before the shift began. A single missing man in a rigidly formed line, stretching down a dimly lit corridor, went entirely unnoticed. 19 men broke down that door. The assassin, wearing a stolen uniform of the Preobrazhensky regiment, slipped from the shadows behind the desk at the exact moment the door gave way. In the smoke and the shouting, he simply joined the chaotic throng. 19 men rushed in. 20 men secured the perimeter. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of the revelation. The sheer brilliance of the ruse, hiding in plain sight, using the very mechanism of security as the vehicle for escape, was breathtaking. "If this is true," Grigorovich whispered, the colour draining from his face, "then the assassin walked right past me. He could be anywhere in Russia by now. He is in this room." The inspector recoiled as if struck. The soldiers shifted uneasily, hands twitching toward their sabres. Holmes pointed a long accusatory finger at a soldier standing third from the right in the rear rank. The man was of average height, his face cast in shadow by the peak of his cap, his jaw clenched tight. "Notice, Inspector, the brass buttons upon this man's tunic," Holmes commanded, his voice echoing in the stillness. "They are polished, yes. However, the thread binding the second button is of a slightly different, coarser cotton than the imperial standard. Notice the boots, issued to the regiment certainly, yet worn down at the heel in a manner consistent with a man who walks with a pronounced inward gait, a gait I observed when these men marched into the room. A gait caused, no doubt, by the agonizing cramps of spending 48 hours curled into a ball within a wooden box. The soldier's eyes widened. His hand shot toward the heavy revolver at his belt. "Seize him!" Grigorovitch roared. The reaction was instantaneous. The soldiers adjacent to the man threw themselves upon him. There was a brief, violent struggle, a guttural cry of Russian defiance, and the man was disarmed and forced to his knees, panting heavily. His cap fell away, revealing a face pale from lack of sunlight, eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising zeal. "You have the man who murdered General Trepoff," Holmes said, turning away from the struggling captive with an air of mild boredom. "You will find his true identity amongst the radical factions in St. Petersburg." Inspector Grigorovitch stared at Holmes, his mouth agape, all previous animosity replaced by a profound, almost superstitious awe. "Mr. Holmes, I have never witnessed such a display of intellect. The Tsar himself shall hear of this." "See that he does," Holmes replied, reaching into his pocket for his pipe. "And inform His Majesty that if his elite Okhrana spent more time examining the interior dimensions of antique furniture and less time harassing the citizenry, they might avoid such embarrassing predicaments." A grateful sovereign. Our journey back to London was markedly more pleasant than our outward voyage. The oppressive heat of August had finally broken, yielding to a cool, refreshing rain that washed the soot from the windows of our train compartment. Holmes, entirely revived by the successful application of his faculties, spent the journey composing a monograph on the various tensile strengths of European floorboards, a subject upon which he had suddenly become an enthusiastic authority. "It was a brilliant deduction, Holmes," I remarked, as we crossed the English Channel, the white cliffs of Dover rising from the misty sea. "To see through such an impenetrable deception." "It was elementary, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, striking a match and puffing a cloud of fragrant blue smoke toward the ceiling of the cabin. "The greatest deceptions always rely on the simplest assumptions. The guards assumed the locked door meant the room was secure. The inspector assumed the empty room meant an impossible escape. Once you strip away the assumptions, the truth, however hidden in a Russian oak desk, stands plainly before you." A fortnight after our return to the quiet familiarity of Baker Street, a small, unadorned package was delivered by a special courier from the Russian embassy. Within it rested a magnificent snuff-box of solid gold, encrusted with brilliant sapphires. Inside the lid was engraved a simple message in French, "From a grateful sovereign." Holmes glanced at it, gave a dismissive little sniff, and tossed it into the drawer of his desk where he kept his spare pipe cleaners. "A pretty bauble, Watson," he murmured, picking up his violin and drawing the bow across the strings in a long, mournful chord. "However, the true reward remains the work itself. Now, hand me yesterday's Times, if you please. I see a curious advertisement regarding a missing flock of cormorants in Cornwall that promises to be infinitely more engaging than the blundering politics of the Romanovs." Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories, be sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below.